Hello and welcome back. In this Black Excellist presentation, we will highlight Wendell Scott, the NASCAR pioneer.
Welcome to blackexcellist.com, the site where we share Black excellence, opulence, and affluence. Our mission is to inspire you as we enlighten you.
We would like to honor and pay tribute to Wendell Scott, the first full-time African-American race car driver in NASCAR, who remained the only black race car driver for most of his career. Given NASCAR's history and racist reputation, it's no shock that Scott was met with racial prejudice and problems not only with its fans, but also its top-level officials. However, Wendell Scott's determination and internal fortitude finally won out and earned him the historic position of being the first black man to be a NASCAR driver. He also holds the distinction of being the first black driver to win a race in NASCAR's Grand National Series. Since Scott's victory, no other African-American driver has taken a win in NASCAR's Premier Division. With nearly 500 Premier League starts, he ranks in the top 40 drivers of all time. We salute Scott's courage and strength as NASCAR was able to right some of its wrongs by finally inducting Scott into the NASCAR Hall of Fame. In this original Black Excellist video, we will be featuring Wendell Scott, the great American stock car racing driver. So without further ado, let's get started. 1. Wendell Oliver Scott was born on August 29, 1921 in Danville, Virginia. Wendell Scott was born on August 29, 1921 in Danville, Virginia. Right from boyhood, Scott yearned to be independent and wanted to be his own boss. At that time in Danville, the local economy was dominated by tobacco processing plants and cotton mills. Scott felt that working at the textile mills was similar to life in prison, since the plant would physically lock the gates behind the employees once they all clocked in during the morning. For that reason, at the age of 11, he started his own bicycle shop, and he took up an interest in cars from his father. His father was a highly skilled mechanic and driver who worked for two wealthy white families. Scott absorbed his family's knowledge in auto mechanics and inherited his father's passion for skillful driving. Wendell grew up in awe of his father and his father's driving style. Wendell became very popular for his racing, and many considered him a daredevil for speeding down Danville's steep hills on only one roller skate. As the only black boy with a bicycle, he would race against white kids with his bike. Even as a small kid, Wendell would race at alarming and frightening speeds on his bicycle, roller skates, or whatever was available. The older people in the neighborhood recognized his need for speed and would often say, "He's just like his daddy." 2. After serving in World War II, Scott opened his own repair shop. After dropping out of high school, Wendell Scott worked as a taxi driver. Soon thereafter, in 1942, he was drafted to serve in the 101st Airborne Division in Europe during World War II. He continued his training as an auto mechanic while serving in the segregated army until 1945. Once Wendell completed his military service, he returned back to Danville where he established an auto repair shop. For the excitement and thrill of the chase, and yes, for the money, Wendell became engaged in transporting moonshine whiskey from Danville, Virginia to Winston-Salem and Charlotte, North Carolina. Running moonshine alcohol was a very common venture for early stock car racers, whose mission was to build cars fast enough to outrun the police. Wendell was somewhat notorious in the region for being able to elude and escape law enforcement. However, the police knew who he was, and in 1949, they apprehended Scott. He was subsequently sentenced to 3 years probation, but that did not stop Scott from engaging in the illegal whiskey runs for quite some time. 3. In 1952, Scott competed in his very first race, where he won 3rd place. Wendell Scott was almost in his 30s, sitting in the bleachers of local speedways, watching white men race. He was bootlegging and very fond of the races in Danville, but due to Jim Crow laws and hostile segregation, Scott didn't have an opportunity to participate in the sport that he loved and admired, until 1952. At this time, the race car business in Danville being run by the Dixie Circuit was struggling. It was not as popular as NASCAR and was on the verge of collapse. To boost popularity and attract more African Americans, the owners and promoters decided to recruit an African American driver. The promoters went to the police, asking if they could help identify the best black driver in the town of Danville. Because of his reputation of eluding the police for years, all fingers pointed to Wendell Scott. On the following day, May 23, 1952, Scott borrowed one of his old bootlegging cars that he'd sold because it was so recognizable by the police. In his first race, Scott placed third place and won $50. Although it was a short heat race for amateurs and he did not win the race outright, the top 3 finish meant everything to Scott. He was now hooked. 4. Wendell Scott was granted a NASCAR license at Richmond Speedway in 1953. Scott experienced multiple incidents of racism and discrimination throughout his life and racing career. He was viciously mocked by the predominantly white crowds, incessantly barraged with racial slurs, deliberately wrecked by other white drivers, mysteriously tire slashed prior to big races, and constantly denied the proper recognition from race officials. In one of the earliest episodes of discrimination in his racing career, he was preparing to participate in a NASCAR-sanctioned race in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. But NASCAR officials refused to allow him to compete after towing his race car for the journey. Scott returned back to Danville with tears in his eyes. A few days later, the same thing happened when he traveled to race at another NASCAR event in High Point, North Carolina. To add insult to injury, officials flat out told him he was not allowed to race because he was black, but they told him that another white driver could race his car. Scott went on to race with the Dixie Circuit and at several non-NASCAR speedways for years. He would run as many as 5 events a week, mostly at Virginia tracks, since he was barred from Darlington Raceway in South Carolina and other races across the Southeast. In the next few years, he won 128 hobby, amateur, and modified races. In spite of his success in being a model ambassador of the sport, officials still hassled him over silly trivia like chip paint on his race cars or mind-boggling harassment about his son's beards. Scott never complained publicly, he just kept on impressing in his non-NASCAR races. Some spectators jeered him, but others began rooting for him. Several prejudiced drivers would crash him, but others came to respect him. A few Southern newspapers started to publish positive reviews about Scott and his performances. Scott understood that to rise in the sport, he somehow had to gain the attention of NASCAR, and that would be by winning races and winning over fans. In 1953, on the Northern Virginia circuit, he opened his season by winning a race in Staunton. He also tied the qualifying record at that time. A week after his season opener win, Scott won the Waynesboro feature. This was after he was pole position and smashed the qualifying record. The Waynesboro News-Virginian affirmed that Scott had become recognized as one of the most popular drivers to appear here. Although Scott hadn't met the founder and top exec of NASCAR, Bill France, he found a way to slip in NASCAR through a proverbial side door without the knowledge of NASCAR's headquarters. He towed his race car to a local NASCAR event at the old Richmond Speedway and persuaded the steward, Mike Poston, to grant him a NASCAR license. Poston, a part-timer, was not a powerful figure. However, he held the key authority of issuing NASCAR licenses. Poston gave Scott a license, helping Scott become the first black driver to compete in a NASCAR-sanctioned race. 5. Scott would win races despite inferior cars, financial challenges, and racism. With a NASCAR license in his pocket, Scott began racing competitively at the highest level against other top NASCAR drivers. Scott was very successful against drivers and teams who had the more powerful, expensive modified stock cars. Scott would go on to race at the likes of Daytona Beach, where he competed for the first time at the iconic track in February 1954. Later that spring, he would meet NASCAR founder and president Bill France for the first time. France would give peripheral support and help Scott on numerous occasions, and once even told him, "You're a NASCAR member, and as of now, you will always be treated as a NASCAR member." But that was easier said than done. Nonetheless, Scott was able to garner white fans and admiration from fellow racers due to his talent, hard work, and knowledge as a mechanic. He became a regular winner in heat races and consolations, and Scott regularly finished in the top 5 in features at several tracks. He still faced financial challenges, sometimes not having enough money for gas to travel to races or not enough to fuel his race cars. And he still faced hostile and racist fans while contending with the hatred from his colleagues, who would collide with him to cause him to lose races. As NASCAR's only black competitor, Scott was competing for his own pride, racial equality, and for much needed money. Even with all of the hostilities, racism, and discrimination, Scott placed 3rd in NASCAR's Sportsman Points for Virginia. At Norfolk Speedway, he finished 3rd in season points. He would celebrate even more wins and successes in 1958 and 1959. By the end of 1959, Scott's consistent finishes near the top of the field paid off as he won both the NASCAR Sportsman Championship for the state of Virginia, as well as the season championship in the Sportsman class at Southside Speedway. 6. Wendell moved up to NASCAR's Grand National Series in 1961. Scott's debut in NASCAR's Grand National Series, now known as the Cup Series, took place on March 4, 1961 in South Carolina at the half-mile dirt track in Spartanburg. However, the top officials at NASCAR did not want the crowd to know that Scott was participating in the race. He was excluded from all of the media coverage, interviews, stories, and publications leading up to the race. There was no mention of a black driver joining the circuit, and Scott's name wasn't included anywhere. To make matters worse, the broadcaster was instructed to introduce the African-American driver as W.D. Scott. NASCAR officials didn't even want to recognize his first name, Wendell, because they felt it might have angered the 6,000 fans in attendance at the Piedmont Interstate Fairgrounds. All in all, for a rookie with a third-rate car in a climate where Confederate flags replaced the green flag to signal the start of a race, Scott had put together a respectable season. He ran 23 races and finished in the top 10 5 times. He was hands down the obvious choice for the Rookie of the Year award. However, NASCAR announced that the award would go to a driver who only ran 5 races, a driver who scored only 1 top 10 finish, and a driver who trailed behind Scott by more than 1,000 points in the standings. Unbelievable. However, one of the most significant days of his life is also mired with the most controversy. A controversy that still exists almost 6 decades later. In 1963, Scott started his 3rd season at the Grand National level with a new car, new attitude, and new optimism. Later that year, on December 1st, Scott drove his number 34 for 202 laps at a Grand National race at the Speedway Park in Jacksonville, Florida. Scott outran the entire field, including Richard Petty, who he passed with 25 laps remaining. Scott led the pack after 200 laps, but the checkered flag was not raised when he passed the finish line. Another lap later, still no flag. He crossed the line again, but he was shocked to learn that the white second-place driver was announced as the winner of the race. Only 10 of 22 cars were still running at the end, and 4 of those were at least 15 laps behind. After submitting a protest, NASCAR overturned its decision, but they wouldn't announce Scott as the winner until 2 hours later, after all of the fans left the Jacksonville track and the trophy was nowhere to be found. Scott received the first place check, but would be given a second-rate, makeshift trophy 4 weeks later at a race in Savannah. To be blunt, it wasn't much of a trophy, just a piece of wood without a top or even an inscription stating his placing, date of the race, or title of the race itself. It would take 2 years later for NASCAR to officially correct his records and award Scott with the win. It would take even longer for Scott's family to receive a replica of the trophy from the Jacksonville Stock Car Racing Hall of Fame in 2010, some 20 years after Wendell had passed away. With all of the controversy, it can't be denied that Wendell Scott is the first black racer to win on NASCAR's highest level, a distinction he still holds. Despite operating on a low budget and without any corporate sponsorships through the rest of the 1960s, he kept on racing competitively. He finished 12th in 1964, even after missing a few races. He was a regular top 10 finisher in the point standings. He finished the 1966 season with a career-high 6th. In 1969, he reached his top year in winnings with $47,451. 7. The movie Greased Lightning is based on the true life story of Wendell Scott. Greased Lightning was the first feature film in which Richard Pryor would receive top billing. Pryor played the role of Wendell Scott alongside Pam Grier as his wife in the 1977 action-filled biopic. Greased Lightning chronicled Wendell Scott's racing career from his early days transporting moonshine to his astonishing success in NASCAR's Grand National races. The film suffered from the same fate that often afflicted Wendell Scott throughout his career as a race driver: insufficient funds. Director Michael Schultz leveraged his genius and Pryor's comedy in this classic, much like the rest of his films, which include Cooley High, Car Wash, Which Way Is Up, Bustin' Loose, and Crush Groove. As for Greased Lightning, Wendell Scott served as a technical consultant on the film, but he was not impressed with the stunt car drivers. However, the stunt coordination and team of drivers performed their best with the budget they had in making the track action look real, along with some skillful editing. Nonetheless, Richard Pryor is reported to have felt the proudest of this role than any other because of how Scott was able to further the cause of civil rights in the arena of sports. Unfortunately, there was only a mild reception to the movie at the box office, which ended Scott's hope of finally profiting from his racing career. His contract with Warner Brothers gave him a share in the profits, but true wealth from the film never materialized. 8. Scott married Mary Coles in 1943, and they were blessed with 7 children. Wendell met his wife Mary around 1940. While serving in the Army, he and Mary married in 1943. They began raising their family in Danville, eventually having 7 children: Willie Ann, Wendell Jr., Franklin, Deborah, Cheryl, Sybil, and Michael. Mary Scott was the driving force behind the scene for NASCAR's first African-American winner. She was a friendly and welcoming presence in the garage during her husband's competitive days in NASCAR. Her love and support provided Wendell a foundation for his many years of racing excellence and helped guide him in his plight to become a legend. Sons Wendell Jr. and Franklin, along with grandson Warwick, have continued the fight to ensure that Wendell is properly recognized by NASCAR and their fans. They are engaged in an ongoing campaign to guarantee that Wendell's legacy continues to live on and inspires future generations. Today, the Wendell Scott Foundation memorializes his namesake's achievements with a museum and a program that provides students with opportunities to learn about science, engineering, technology, and mathematics. 9. Wendell Scott was forced to retire after a major race crash in 1973. Due to injuries sustained from an accident at Talladega Speedway in Alabama in 1973, Scott had to quit racing for good. With just 9 laps in, Scott and other drivers had a crash on the infield. The hand-welded roll cage of Wendell Scott's 1971 Mercury Montego race car was pushed into his seat. This infamous wreck left him with fractures to his knees, leg, pelvis, and ribs. The horrific crash was described as the worst NASCAR crash in history. Before his retirement, Scott ran 495 races over 13 years in his NASCAR Cup Series career. He achieved 147 top 10 finishes, a pole, and a win. In his Grand National East Series career, he ran 17 races over 2 years. Unfortunately, Wendell Scott passed away on December 23, 1990, in his hometown of Danville, Virginia. He left this earth at the age of 69 due to complications from spinal cancer. He is buried in Cunningham Cemetery, Danville, Virginia. 10. Wendell Scott was inducted in the NASCAR Hall of Fame in 2015. Barred from some races and often cheated in scoring, it's incredible what Scott was able to accomplish despite never landing any corporate sponsors, which could have afforded him a first-rate vehicle and a professional crew. Still, he managed to rank among the top 10 drivers in 147 national races. While Scott's recognition is debated by NASCAR, his achievements have won honors elsewhere. He has a street named after him in his hometown of Danville. In 2013, Scott was awarded his historical marker in Danville, Virginia. In April 2012, Scott was nominated for inclusion into the NASCAR Hall of Fame, and on January 30th, 2015, Wendell Oliver Scott was posthumously inducted. Other Hall of Fame inductions include the International Motorsports Hall of Fame in Talladega, Alabama, the National Motorsports Press Association Hall of Fame in Darlington, South Carolina, and the Virginia Sports Hall of Fame and Museum in Portsmouth. While Jackie Robinson's integration of Major League Baseball may have had a bigger impact on the civil rights movement and integrating his sport, Wendell Scott's accomplishments should not be undermined. Most of Robinson's games took place in northern cities, whereas Scott's breaking of the NASCAR color barrier took place in the Deep South, where black athletes faced greater odds, greater danger, and more hostile venues. It should be noted that the Brooklyn Dodgers and Major League Baseball actively recruited Robertson and other African-American All-Stars. While NASCAR neither celebrated, promoted, or even talked publicly about Scott. NASCAR's evident disinterest in providing any coverage or commemoration publicly served to rob Wendell Scott during his lifetime of the distinction or financial gain he deserved as the sport's first African-American driver. Scott leaves an endearing legacy that he carved out during a tumultuous time. Few can understand the obstacles Scott faced in the world of NASCAR 50 years ago, yet he showed up 495 times with his number 34 race car during a 13-year NASCAR career with the same objective: to drive hard and win. For many, it was about race. For Scott, it was only about racing.
We appreciate the fact that you stayed with us until the end. Thank you for spending time with us, and don't forget to like this video. Also, make sure you subscribe so that you never miss a video. Bye for now. We will see you tomorrow.